In both the psalm and the passage of John, we find ourselves invited into prayer. Sometimes that's where we can find the love that binds us. The psalmist invites us into a prayer of praise, while the Gospel of John invites us as a witness to a prayer of intimacy between Jesus and God. I found this interesting, and at first, in my exploration of this text, I looked at what would draw these two passages together. And then I wondered, but what about prayer itself? In the first century Mediterranean world, the world of Jesus, prayer was a socially symbolic act of communication between two persons or two entities. Usually the person praying was making some sort of an appeal to the other, who seemed to have power over the general order of existence. This is not unlike a child who, when they realize that they've done something wrong, asks their parents for forgiveness. In the child's view, the parent has power over their existence. We do the same thing today in our religious prayer. We make an appeal to God, whom we believe not only has the power over our existence, but is also the source and creator of that very existence. Jesus' prayer in the Gospel of John is of this quality. Jesus enters into prayer because of a series of uncertain events that are unfolding for him. Jesus' prayer is quite special. He is asking God to reveal God's glory to his followers, his believers, to you and to me. Have you ever prayed to know God better, more intimately? I have. I remember when I was in my early 20s and starting to work full-time. I was a very devout Christian, and I prayed regularly and fervently. Mostly, I would ask for guidance. But there was one thing that I wanted more than anything else. I really wanted to know God, and I wanted God to know me too. I really wanted to hear God speak to me. I wanted to hear it in my own ears. I would practice being very, very still and listening very quietly to everything. I remember wondering if God was speaking to me when something would fall to the floor, or when a bird would sing, or if someone was asking for help. Was it really God asking me? I would listen extra deeply at church, and I would say yes to every single service asked of me. And then one day, I had a terrible accident which almost took my life. In my recovery, I was very, very confused, and I thought somehow that the accident was punishment for something. I didn't believe that God would speak to me anymore. I lost all of my ability to listen, and I became very, very needy. I was living in France at the time, and Jean Vanier, the founder of the community I was living in, suggested that I go live in a community in England that was for spiritual growth and healing. This was an ecumenical community of prayer, so every day, several times a day, we would gather for prayer. I was by far the youngest member, being only 24. I remember finding it impossible to get to prayer on time, or to focus on prayer, or to sit the right way in prayer. And then there was the singing. I constantly sung the wrong words and the wrong tune. This was very devastating for me, and yet no matter how hard I tried, I felt that I was the biggest disappointment that had ever existed. After a few months of living this type of disappointment, someone in the community invited me to grow a garden. I didn't have the first clue what to do. What do I plant? And when? And how do I make the rows? And how many? I had so many questions, and the answer was always the same. I don't know. It's up to you. So I asked the others, what are you going to plant? And one person said, I'm only going to grow pumpkins so that I can make pompones. Really? Another one said, I'm going to grow potatoes, and potatoes need lots of space, so I won't have room for anything else. And I thought, how boring. Slowly, some ideas emerged from within me. What about things that I like to eat, like Swiss chard and beans and kale? And then I thought about making my garden pretty, So I chose sweet peas and borage for their beautiful blossoms, and sunflowers for their enormity, just because. And I worked very, very hard. I would get up way before the others. I remember getting up at 4:30. I would start my gardening at first light. And when all the seeds were finally in, I would go each day and sing to the rows of hidden seeds, encouraging them to come up. And I remember the joy that I felt when I saw the first crack in the soil where a bean sprout was trying to push through. I remember dancing and singing amongst the sunflowers as their leaves would lean towards the sun like great big ears. And then it struck me. They were just like me, listening intently for the voice of God. And so I began to watch them and all of the plants carefully, and I noticed that I began to feel delight and connection deep within my soul. I didn't even know how it happened, but I remember feeling like I was going to be okay, and maybe I was even special. Later, I realized that when I prayed in the midst of people, like in the meditation room, I would judge myself through their eyes. I was not okay with my own brokenness, and when I sat with it in the midst of others, I felt awkward and shameful. But when I was in my garden, I didn't feel this way at all. I didn't feel judged by the plants. Eventually, I began to arrive at morning prayer on time, and what made the difference was that I would imagine that I was walking into my garden rather than into the meditation room. I was even able to sit tall because I would imagine that I was the sunflower reaching for the sun. And soon my prayer sounded in my ears like that of the psalmist. Sing to God, O plants of the earth. Turn your leaves to the Lord, O wind in the heavens, you who have been there from the beginning. Listen, God sends out his voice, his mighty voice, and all you growing things, you proclaim the power of God to those whose presence is over all of those who struggle for a relationship with God, and whose power is in the wind. Awesome is God in this garden, the God of those who struggle. God gives power and strength to his creations. Blessed be God. So as you can see, I was able to move from a place of pleading with God for an experience of presence to praising God for the presence that I had come to know. This transformation came through a period of time that can best be described as suffering. It was not by my own work that I was transformed, but by the grace of God. In our text today, we have heard both praise and plea. In both, we hear about God's glory, praise for it, and then a plea for it. In the praise of God's glory in the Psalms, we encounter the relationship between the human and God, much like my own experience. In the Jesus plea for God's glory, we are given a glimpse into the relationship between Jesus and God, and glory or glorification is a large part of this relationship. In fact, in the Gospel of John, Jesus is not glorified until after his resurrection. This passage that we read here today, only 1 week before Pentecost, occurs in the Gospel of John right before Jesus is turned over to the Jewish leaders. We are reading a prayer that Jesus prays as his suffering is building up before him like a wave rising to a threatening crest. What John does is divert the attention of the reader from Jesus' work, his ministry, his action in his life, to Jesus' glorification with God through his suffering, through his death, and through his resurrection. This prayer takes place while Jesus is with his closest companions, and Jesus prays for his glorification so that his companions will have eternal life. The work that Jesus did in his life was for the glory of God, and now Jesus wants God to glorify him for the sake of his companions, for the sake of his followers, because he sees that they have believed. And so we need to understand that what glory is, to get a better grasp of what Jesus was asking. Glory refers to God's honor, God's splendor. Some people call it the unspoken manifestation of God. It's that experience of God that makes you silent with awe. In the Hebrew Bible, Words like majesty and power are used to describe glory. John's gospel uses this word 42 times. The word glory happens mostly in the Christian Testament, and of all the times that it happens in the Christian Testament, 1/3 of those times happens in the Gospel of John. So John is very interested in this relation to Jesus because he believes that glory is available for human participation. When John speaks about glory, he places the human person right in the middle of it. So if glory is the unspoken manifestation of God, then John is suggesting that humanity is intimately connected to the presence of God. So let us listen to the prayer again, at least the beginning. Jesus begins by looking up and then saying, "Father, the hour has come. Glorify." And he goes on from there. We hear John here making a direct reference to Jesus' emotions. He refers to Jesus' eyes through looking, to Jesus' expression. He has Jesus speaking the prayer out loud, and to Jesus' action by having Jesus ask God to act through glory. In the ancient world, the human person was understood to function according to 3 areas: that of emotion, that of expression, and that of action. The significance of this is that John wants the hearer of this text, you, to get a sense of the whole human experience, to hear this from Jesus, who is both human and God. John's Jesus seeks this glorification so that he can offer eternal life to his followers. So by portraying Jesus as a whole human person with all of his emotions and all of his expression and all of his actions, John creates a link between eternal life, or knowledge of the one true God, and the whole human experience. In other words, to know God as the one true God invites a believer to experience God intimately, as if God is part of our DNA, the same way that Jesus is part of God. This is concretely what Jesus is praying for. Listen. "Holy Father, protect them in your name that you have given me." They have the same name. "So that they may be one as we are one." Jesus wants believers to feel one with God the way he does. Perhaps you can feel the intimacy, or perhaps you still feel one step removed. Let me offer you a hand to step yet closer. In verse 10, we hear Jesus describe his relationship with God in very intimate terms. "All mine are yours, and yours are mine." Doesn't that sound familiar? When people are life partners, we often hear them say, "What's mine is yours, and what's yours is mine." Or in my case, "What's mine is mine, and what's yours is mine." That's not what Jesus does. Of course, he makes it balanced and equal. This is what Jesus says to God. This is the language of a contractual relationship, a relationship that is bound with love for eternity. Jesus asks God to embrace a relationship with humanity that is intimate and enduring as an eternal contract. Now, this is not new, because God already did this with the Israelites in the desert in the 10 Commandments. So why does Jesus plead to God for this again now? In Jesus' prayer, we hear that Jesus was with God in creation before the world existed, and God sent Jesus to do God's work on earth, to glorify God. This was needed because humanity needed some redirection. So here in John, Jesus does not go and pray alone in a garden. No, in this prayer, Jesus is in the company of his followers. Jesus is praying this prayer so that the believers, including us, will hear it and believe. The next thing that happens to Jesus is that he suffers, dies, and resurrects. For John, this is all one experience. They cannot be separated. Suffering, dying, and resurrecting are one. Jesus knows this is about to happen, but the disciples do not. Jesus wants to prepare them to live in glory with God. It is through Jesus' suffering, death, and resurrection that he is glorified, and this inaugurates eternal life for all believers, including us here today. Jesus shows us the way to glory. The path to glory does not come at our own will. It does not come according to our own timing. It comes rather as an act of grace when we surrender to belief in God. This ability to surrender is often a result of suffering. The only reason for this is that suffering tends to make us less resistant to the presence of God. Haven't you noticed that? When you're really struggling, what do? Pray. We all do this. Through this prayer, Jesus wants believers to know that they are one with God, just as he is. That somehow, by our very nature, we are intrinsically united with the divine. That this is our birthright, rather than something we need to work toward. Yet somehow, in our human journey, we fall into a belief that we are separate from God. This belief is, in fact, the cause of our suffering. Jesus' prayer invites all of us to return to our birthright as believers and to live our unity with God. In John 1, it is written, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God, and all things came into being through him. And without him, not one thing came into being." In other words, we came into being through Jesus, through God. And this is our unity. It is our intimate story, and we simply need to remember and believe. Yet it is not that simple. So how do we do this? John invites us through his prayer to learn and practice meeting God through our emotions, through our expressions, and through our actions. In other words, in all of our human experience, God is available to us. We need simply to practice being present to this experience rather than thinking about the experience and wondering, is it good enough? Or am I enough? Or is this too much for God? We need to learn how to surrender to the moment, to hear the bird when it is chirping rather than to go find a chirping bird. We need to hear each other when we are speaking rather than wondering what the other meant after they have gone. We need to love ourselves as we are living rather than expecting ourselves to be different than we are. The ability to do this is a gift of grace, and yet, even grace can be cultivated. And when grace is cultivated, we feel united with God and with each other. This is the experience of God's glory, and this is your birthright. Our God is truly awesome, for our God has planted the seed for knowing God right in our very own soul. Our job is to simply tend the garden within by living the life we have instead of the one we wanted, or feel that we have lost or are afraid of. Remember who you came from and believe. It is there that you will find unity.